What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
I still remember the moment like it happened yesterday, even though it has been months. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to hold it together while I explained my plans for college, how much I needed from them to cover tuition, and why this meant everything to me. My parents sat across from me, pretending to listen, and I could feel that cold distance I had learned to recognize over the years. I thought maybe this time would be different, that maybe they would see how hard I had worked, how serious I was about my future, but the words that came out of their mouths shattered me in ways I didn't know were possible. My father leaned back, glanced at my mother, and said, almost casually, that they simply couldn't afford it. He said it like it was obvious, like there was no room for discussion or compromise, like my dreams were optional and theirs were not. I tried to argue, tried to remind them of all the sacrifices they made when I was younger, tried to show them the opportunities one had lined up if I could just get this support, but they shook their heads. My mother whispered that they had to think about the household expenses, about bills, about money that didn't exist, and I sat there feeling like I had been punched in the gut, struggling to breathe because I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could they tell me they couldn't afford my tuition when I just knew, that money existed for anything they wanted, for anyone they wanted, but not for me? I left that conversation feeling smaller, invisible, and angry, all at the same time, and I didn't speak to them for the rest of the day. That night, I went into my room, trying to hold back tears, telling myself I would find a way, that I didn't need their money, that I was strong enough to figure it out, but a pit in my stomach kept growing. I couldn't shake the sense of betrayal, the sting of realizing that the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally were willing to leave me behind for convenience, for favoritism, for something I couldn't even understand at the time. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't, and my mind kept replaying their faces, the calmness in their voices, the lack of hesitation in their refusal, and I couldn't understand how someone could be so cold. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I found out the full truth. The thing that made my chest tighten and my hands shake, the thing that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My stepmom's daughter, my stepsister, had received a brand new house from my parents, and they didn't even blink when they handed her the keys. I remember seeing the pictures on social media, a perfectly staged celebration, a smile that looked almost smug, like she knew exactly what this meant and how it would affect me. I remember staring at my phone in disbelief, feeling my blood run cold and wondering how I had missed the signs, how I hadn't realized sooner that this had nothing to do with money and everything to do with them picking favorites, rewarding the person who wasn't even their child before me, the person they saw as easier, more deserving, or just more convenient. I wanted to scream, I wanted to confront them immediately, but I couldn't, because the shock and hurt froze me, left me thinking that maybe, just maybe, I was imagining things. I called my best friend that night and poured everything out, the words rushing from me like a dam breaking, and she didn't even have to say much, just listening and agreeing that what they had done was not only unfair but cruel, because it wasn't about finances. It was about control and favoritism and showing me, subtly but undeniably, that I was not enough. I couldn't believe that the people who had raised me, who had promised to guide me through life, were the same people who could look me in the eyes and deny me my education while celebrating someone else's windfall. I kept replaying that day, the look on my father's face, the way my mother had tried to soften it with explanations that didn't make sense, and I realized that there was no mistake, no misunderstanding, and no reason that could justify the betrayal. I understood that day that I had a choice. I could accept it and continue living under their rules, pretending it didn't hurt, or I could decide that this was the line, the moment when I would stop giving them the power to dictate my life and my happiness. I didn't know yet how I would do it, or what it would look like, but the seed of my decision was planted that night. I wasn't going to scream, I wasn't going to cry in front of them anymore, and I wasn't going to beg for anything I deserved. I made a promise to myself that I would find a way to show them, not in a way that would hurt me or make me petty, but in a way that would be undeniable, a way that would make them realize that denying me had been their biggest mistake. And in that moment, as I stared at my phone and scrolled through the pictures of her new house, I felt something shift, a strange mix of rage, clarity, and determination that I had never felt before. I knew that nothing would ever be the same between us, and I knew that I was going to take back every ounce of respect and power they had stolen from me, one way or another, and that they would not see it coming. The moment I realized that my parents could celebrate someone else's life while refusing me what I needed, I decided that this was the day I cut them off in every way that mattered, even if I couldn't yet explain to the world how I would do it. The betrayal had lit a fire inside me that I couldn't ignore, and I spent the rest of the night thinking about all the ways I could reclaim my life, all the ways I could prove that I was enough, all the ways I could turn the tables without them even realizing what had happened until it was too late. After that day, I made a decision that I couldn't fully explain at the time, but I knew it was necessary, and it was simple in my head even if it was complicated in reality. I couldn't rely on my parents anymore, and I couldn't let their choices dictate my life or my self-worth. I told myself that I would handle everything on my own, that I would find a way to make college happen, to prove to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet, and that I didn't need their approval or their money to be someone who mattered. I started small, taking every shift I could at the restaurant where I had worked in high school, then picking up extra hours at the bookstore down the street, and even tutoring younger students after school. I quickly realized that the stress was enormous, balancing all of it while trying to keep my grades up, but at the same time, every dollar I earned, every hour I spent grinding, was a quiet kind of victory that felt stronger than anything my parents could have given me. I felt pride in my exhaustion, in the way my hands hurt from work and my brain ached from studying, because unlike the money they refused me, my achievements were mine, earned, undeniable. During that time, I also started researching scholarships like my life depended on it, sending out essays, filling in applications, and sometimes waiting weeks for a single response that could change everything. Every rejection felt personal at first, a reminder that the world, like my parents, didn't care if I deserved something or not, but slowly I started to see that persistence had its own rewards. I received a notice from one organization, and when I opened it, I felt my chest tighten and my vision blur with relief, because I had won a full scholarship to a college that I had dreamed about for years, a place I had pictured walking into but never thought would happen without their help. I sat there in disbelief, clutching the letter, thinking about my parents and how smug they must have felt celebrating her house while denying me the education that I wanted more than anything, and I realized that I didn't need them to feel proud of me, but I wanted them to understand that denying me had not broken me, it had only made me sharper, more determined, and capable of more than they could have imagined. I found myself talking less to them, not because I wanted to hurt them or because I was petty, but because every conversation seemed to carry that same coldness, that same judgment. And I realized that keeping them in my life the way I had before would only distract me from building what I needed. I was learning that independence was not just about money or survival, it was about reclaiming your mind, your priorities, and your confidence, and with every step I took, I felt the weight of their favoritism lift a little. At the same time, I started noticing the small ways they tried to control the narrative around me, dropping comments in front of family or acquaintances that made it seem like I wasn't capable, that my scholarship was lucky, that I didn't have the skills or the talent to get by on my own, and instead of reacting, I let them talk, because I realized that every word they said was only making my eventual triumph sweeter. I also began spending more time with friends who genuinely supported me, people who didn't have to think twice about encouraging me, helping me proofread essays, or listening to my fears about money, work, and the constant pressure of balancing everything alone. The support from them became a quiet rebellion against my parents, a reminder that love and respect don't come automatically just because someone gives birth to you or raises you. And I felt the sting of that truth every time I realized how much I had been missing from my own parents. During this period, I started imagining the moment when I would finally show them what I had accomplished, not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted them to understand that they had underestimated me, that their decisions had not destroyed me, and that I had become stronger precisely because of their refusal. Every night, I worked late, planned my schedule, calculated finances, and imagined a future where I would never need to rely on their mercy again, and slowly, A sense of purpose replaced the anger that had consumed me immediately after the betrayal. I wasn't acting out of spite anymore. I was acting out of strategy, patience, and determination, knowing that the best revenge would not be loud or dramatic, but undeniable and clean, the kind that left no doubt that I had won. I also started noticing patterns in their behavior, little cracks in their confidence and pride, and I stored them away, not yet acting, just observing, because I knew that one day, the knowledge would be useful in ways that words could never capture. By the time the school year began, I had my scholarship in hand, my work schedule under control, and a sense of self that my parents could not touch, no matter what they spent on anyone else. I knew that my stepsister's house meant nothing to me anymore, that their favor had no hold over my achievements, and that the real power came from building my own life without them, quietly, deliberately, and without apology. And for the first time since that day at the kitchen table, I felt a sense of calm in my anger, a confidence that the next steps I would take would be mine and mine alone, and when the time came, they would not even see it coming. By the time my second semester started, I had settled into a rhythm that was exhausting but empowering, and I realized that every struggle, every hour spent working multiple jobs, and every rejection I had faced in applying for scholarships had prepared me for something bigger than I had expected. I had made the choice to distance myself from my parents, but now I understood that distancing wasn't enough. I needed to reclaim a part of my life that they had tried to control, a part that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with proving that their favoritism and neglect would not define me. And I began thinking about how to do it in a way that would be unmistakable, deliberate, and satisfying. I didn't want to lash out or make a scene. I wanted every move to be calculated, every success to be undeniable, and every step I took to show them, without words, that denying me had been their biggest mistake. I started small, paying attention to the way they conducted themselves with family and friends, noting every comment about me and every praise for my stepsister, and I stored them like pieces of a puzzle that I would eventually put together to reveal the truth. I realized that the world outside my parents' control was full of opportunities, and if I could navigate it carefully, I could not only survive without them but also surpass them in ways that would leave no doubt about my value, my intelligence, and my independence. During this period, I began to reach out to people I had admired from afar, mentors and professionals in fields I wanted to pursue, carefully crafting messages that highlighted my achievements without sounding desperate, and to my surprise, many responded with encouragement and guidance, giving me advice that I had never received from the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally. I was learning that relationships built on respect and shared goals were infinitely more valuable than those built on family ties alone, and that every connection I made, every mentor I impressed, became another layer in the foundation I was building for a life that they could not influence. It was empowering, but it also fed the fire inside me, the part that remembered vividly the day they refused to invest in my future while spending freely on someone who hadn't earned the same opportunities. And I realized that I was preparing for something beyond personal success, something that would make the impact of my achievements resonate in a way that they could not ignore. I also began documenting everything, not obsessively, but with intention, keeping notes on conversations, recording milestones in my academic and professional life, and silently noting the ways my parents presented me to others, often undermining my accomplishments or framing them as luck rather than skill, while framing my stepsister's successes as natural and deserved. It hurt at first, seeing the disparities so clearly, but gradually it became a tool, a way to measure just how far I had come and how carefully I could plan my next steps. I realized that I could use patience and strategy to create a scenario where my independence and achievements would speak louder than any argument or explanation, and that by doing so, I could reclaim a sense of control and dignity that had been denied to me for years. One afternoon, as I was preparing for a crucial presentation at school, I received a text from my mother, casual, almost innocent, asking how I was doing and whether I was managing to pay for all my expenses. For a split second, I considered responding, explaining my accomplishments, or even sharing some of the victories I had achieved without their support, but then I realized that withholding this information, letting them remain unaware of my progress, was more powerful than any confrontation. I was no longer a child seeking approval or validation. I was a woman in control of her own life, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they would eventually find out everything without my prompting was intoxicating. It was the first time I truly understood that revenge didn't have to be immediate or allowed to be effective. It could be subtle, calculated, and ultimately devastating because it came with no warning and no opportunity for interference. At the same time, I began planting small seeds with other family members and acquaintances, letting them witness my achievements, my independence, and my growing confidence, all without my parents' involvement. Every compliment, every recognition, every nod of approval from someone who mattered in our extended circle felt like a quiet jab at the choices my parents had made. A way of reclaiming not only respect, but also authority over how my life was perceived. I watched as their narratives about me began to unravel, noticing the subtle discomfort in their eyes when they realized that I was thriving without their support, and that sense of quiet victory reinforced my belief that my strategy was working. By the end of the semester, I had built not just a life for myself, but a network, a reputation, and a growing sense of independence that my parents could not touch or diminish, and I knew that I was ready for the next step. I wasn't acting recklessly, but I was planning carefully, identifying the moments and the opportunities where I could create an undeniable statement of my worth. A demonstration that their favoritism had been not just unfair, but ultimately self-defeating, and in the back of my mind, I could already feel the anticipation building, knowing that when the right moment came, it would not just be satisfying, but absolutely unforgettable. By the time I entered my third year of college, I had built a life that was completely my own, and yet, every interaction with my parents reminded me of the gap between what they were willing to give and what I had earned without them. And I knew that the time had come to make my next move, not out of anger, but as a calculated step that would finally make them recognize the consequences of their choices. I had spent months quietly observing how they managed their finances, how they treated family and friends, and how they flaunted their favoritism toward my stepsister, and in that quiet observation, I had discovered patterns that were predictable and exploitable, and I began to plan a form of revenge that would be clean, precise, and impossible to dismiss as mere luck or coincidence. It was important to me that it was brilliant in its simplicity, that it made a statement without needing words, and that it left no room for them to twist the narrative. I started reaching out to contacts I had cultivated through internships and scholarship programs, asking for introductions, advice, and opportunities, and every interaction became another building block in the foundation of what I was preparing. At the same time, I was careful to maintain the appearance of a life that was growing quietly, because I knew that any overt display of success too early would alert my parents, and I wanted the reveal to be absolute, complete, and shocking. I applied for an internship with a firm that I knew had ties to companies my parents admired, a place that could provide both professional credibility and a social context in which my achievements could not be ignored. And I poured myself into the application process, interviews, and projects, knowing that each step was preparing the stage for the moment when my independence and brilliance would be undeniable. Every late night spent researching, every hour I dedicated to perfecting my work, and every risk I took in networking without their knowledge was a quiet act of preparation. And I felt a growing sense of satisfaction knowing that the final move would not just be mine to execute, but also perfectly timed and unavoidable. During this period, I also began documenting my progress meticulously, tracking emails, saving letters of recommendation, and noting accolades and achievements in ways that could be shared at the right time to make the maximum impact. And I realized that I was no longer motivated by anger or hurt alone, but by the anticipation of showing them the results of their own decisions, demonstrating in a clear and undeniable way that they had misjudged me, that their refusal to support me had not limited me, and that my stepsister's advantage had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with favoritism. I was patient, but that patience was strategic, because I knew that the more time I allowed for my achievements to accumulate unnoticed, the more powerful the eventual reveal would be, and I took careful note of the smallest slips, the offhand comments, and the assumptions my parents made about my life, knowing that all of them would eventually be part of the impact when they finally realized the scope of what I had accomplished without them. I began to involve trusted friends and colleagues in subtle ways, making sure that my progress and competence were visible in circles my parents valued, and I was careful to ensure that my stepsister was never included in these interactions, because her presence would dilute the effect, and I wanted the statement to be unambiguous. Every meeting I attended, every presentation I delivered, and every recognition I received was another step in setting the stage for the moment when my parents would no longer be able to dismiss or belittle me. And I felt a growing sense of confidence that the patience, planning, and effort I had invested would finally pay off in a way that was satisfying, undeniable, and emotionally explosive. I understood that the key to brilliance in this kind of revenge was control, and I had more control now than I ever had before, and every decision I made was deliberate, every interaction carefully considered, and every opportunity seized with the awareness that it would eventually contribute to the ultimate payoff. By the end of the year, I had everything in place to make a statement that would not require any explanations, debates, or confrontations, and the anticipation of watching their reaction. Knowing that they would finally realize that the person they had underestimated and dismissed had not just survived without them, but had built something extraordinary, was intoxicating. I knew that when the moment arrived, it would be precise, satisfying, and completely my own, and that no one could take away the sense of triumph I had earned through years of effort, strategy, and resilience. I had transformed their neglect and favoritism into motivation, patience, and planning, and I was finally ready to execute the move that would leave no question about who had truly won, and for the first time since that day at the kitchen table, I felt completely in control, and I knew that nothing would ever make me doubt the path I had chosen or the power I had earned for myself. The day finally arrived when all of the patience, planning, and quiet maneuvering I had invested over the past few years could be brought together into a single, undeniable moment, and I remember feeling a mix of anticipation, satisfaction, and a kind of calm that only comes from knowing that you are fully in control of the outcome and that every detail has been carefully set in place so that there is no way to misinterpret the message I was about to deliver. I had arranged everything so that my parents would be exposed to the full scope of what I had accomplished without any help from them, and I knew that the impact would be devastating not because I had acted out of malice, but because it would reveal the truth they had refused to acknowledge, the consequences of their decisions that they had spent years pretending did not exist, and the brilliance of the independence I had carved out for myself in a world that they had tried to limit for me. I had rehearsed the timing, the way information would reach them through mutual acquaintances, and the subtle way it would ripple through the family and social circles, all designed to ensure that the effect could not be dismissed, minimized, or redirected. It started with a phone call from someone my parents respected professionally, someone who had seen my work, my growth, and my achievements firsthand, and who casually mentioned in passing that I had secured a position that not only exceeded anything my stepsister had been offered, but also came with a level of recognition and responsibility that my parents could not ignore. I knew that once the news reached them, their first instinct would be denial, to rationalize or explain it away, and I allowed that to happen, letting them stew in the ambiguity, unable to directly confront me without acknowledging their own failures, which made the eventual reveal even more potent and satisfying. The information was framed as a casual conversation, but every detail was intentional, and I could imagine their reaction growing from surprise to discomfort to the slow, creeping realization that the child they had refused to invest in had outperformed, outmaneuvered, and outshone the one they had always favored. While they were processing that, I orchestrated the next step, an invitation to a gathering that included friends, relatives, and professional contacts who had been following my progress quietly and who would not hesitate to acknowledge my success openly. I arrived knowing exactly what I needed to say, but also understanding that the power of the moment was in subtlety, in allowing my achievements to speak louder than any explanation or argument. And I could feel the shift in the room as people began to comment on my accomplishments, asking questions, expressing admiration, and showing respect in ways that my parents had never extended to me. I watched as their smiles faltered, their attempts at casual conversation became forced, and the comparison they had tried to engineer between my stepsister and me dissolved completely under the weight of undeniable facts. And I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that no one could rewrite this narrative or claim it as luck. Finally, I addressed the part that mattered most to me, the part that had caused the most pain and resentment over the years, which was the fact that they had refused to fund my education while providing freely for my stepsister. I did not shout, accuse, or demand an apology, because that would have reduced the impact. Instead, I made a subtle statement in the presence of everyone who mattered, sharing a milestone that directly demonstrated how far I had come without their financial support, framing it as an achievement of resilience and intelligence rather than revenge, and the room collectively acknowledged the truth of it. The realization hit them slowly, and I could see it in their faces as they pieced together the magnitude of their misjudgment, the clear contrast between the child they had neglected and the one they had favored, and I understood that this moment, this precise execution, was far more satisfying than any confrontation or argument could ever have been. By the end of the evening, I knew that my independence, intelligence, and strategic planning had been fully validated, and the quiet, precise, and emotionally satisfying nature of the revelation meant that no one could question my accomplishments or the choices I had made to achieve them. My parents were forced to confront the truth without me needing to say a single accusatory word, and that realization, the acknowledgement of my success, resilience, and brilliance, was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. I left that night knowing that I had turned the tables completely, that I had created a life that was entirely my own, and that I had demonstrated with clarity and precision that their decisions had consequences they could not control or ignore. And for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of triumph so complete that it did not require them to validate it, it only required them to witness it. I had won in every way that mattered, and the brilliance of the moment was undeniable, irreversible, and unforgettable.